Welcome everybody, this is my first video. I actually didn't intend to put any video on my channel. I contribute to the Apocryphal Apocalypse. The reason why I'm doing this video is simply because I want to respond as soon as possible, because it seems that Steve Christie, or Born Again RN, demands this. He feels insulted because I'm not mentioning his name. He feels that I'm arrogant because of this, and it would take time when it could get published on the Apocryphal Apocalypse, since I have no access to the channel. I'm just sending the material to my team members, and that's all. So the easiest way how to respond is just put this brief video on my channel. And so what I'm going to respond here are some accusations, and I don't really want to take more time with this introduction, so let's just jump into it, what Steve has to say about me.
Hello everyone, this is Steve Christie, aka Born Again RN. Earlier in 2024, Dr. David Szaraz, an apologist with Apocryphal Apocalypse, made a lengthy 8-part, nearly 12-hour response video series attempting to defend the consistency of the Roman Catholic canon in church councils. However, even though it was in response specifically to me, and he even shared screenshots that I made and spoke on other YouTube channels like Javier Perdomo, Dr. Szaraz purposely refused to mention me by name, which was condescending, disrespectful, and arrogant, since generally when you critique someone, you should at the very least attempt to show respect for them, even if you don't agree with their arguments. Yet in attempting to defend the consistency of these local church councils...
Okay, so let's stop here. So notice what Steve said, that my 8-part series is a response specifically to him. That's what he said, right? And he calls me arrogant and condescending and all this stuff because I didn't mention him by name, even though I used his materials or screenshots, he says. First thing, when you look at actually the very first part of my videos, and by the way, I put the links into the description box to this video, so you know what videos we are both referring to. If you look at my first part, I actually lay out who I'm responding to. And I clearly and explicitly say that I'm responding to a scholar known as Bogeat, and that partially I'm also going to respond to Danter. So I made it very explicit who I'm responding to, okay? That's so. If he says that I'm arrogant because I didn't mention his name, well, I think it's much more arrogant when you misrepresent the other side. But look, I'm a Christian and I don't take this offensive by any means. I actually honored that I rent free in Steve's head, because it seems that I'm very important to him. That's a pleasure and honor for me, and the way he's speaking about me, you know, I'm honored. I'm honored to get these insults from him. I'm not doing the same thing, actually, or I'm not aware I did any time. But here's the thing. If he thinks that I'm specifically did these series as a response specifically to him, I don't know how he wants to justify this, because first I said very clearly I'm responding to those scholars, and I'm actually citing them, those very things I'm responding to. And the second, you know, it's true that I brought one slide, one screenshot, not screenshots, but one single screenshot from Steve, and it was the so-called errors in the book of Baruch. And probably I also, if I recall correctly, addressed one of his blunders about when Jerome says that we omitted the Baruch, or we omitted the book of Baruch. This is what he says in his prologue to Jeremiah. Sorry. This is where I also bring up Steve's argument, which is completely hilarious, and he cannot defend it. But regarding the rest of the things, I'm specifically addressing scholars and not Steve Christie. As a matter of fact, I don't feel the need to respond to Steve Christie at all. I saw his rebuttal videos to my series. I think it's terrible, and he didn't actually prove anything. And I don't find there anything compelling for responding to. I'm just honest, really. And the second thing, many of the things he is saying, either on his channel or other channels, is just a rehashing of various arguments that were there on the internet for a very long time. Many things are just repeated from, for example, James 1 or James White. In fact, many times when you look at the presentations or the material from Steve Christie, it's almost identical, So I think that might be also arrogant when Steve Christie uses these other Protestant apologists, and he is not citing or not mentioning them by name, because he uses many materials from James 1 or James White, and it seems as if this was Steve Christie's original material. No, it's not. Actually, many things are just repeated from someone else. So I don't know why Steve thinks that I'm responding specifically to him. I might be just specifically responding to James White or James Swan, who bring up the very same things, and in fact they brought up this even before Steve Christie. As a matter of fact, I was working on the Esdras material since the year 2009, if I recall correctly, when I first watched the debate between James White and Gary Michuda. And actually, that was the point when I started to work on the Esdras material, because I found that interesting. And yeah, it took like 4 or 5 years, to collect all the materials, to write the notes. So if Steve thinks that I'm responding specifically because of him, that's absolutely nonsense. And he cannot even prove it. Second, I made it explicit that who I'm responding to. Third, I was working on the Esdras material even before Steve brought this thing up. So no, Steve, I'm sorry, I was not responding specifically to you. I might brought you up marginally, but actually, you might think this is arrogant. I don't think this is arrogant at all. I'm not going to mention each and every apologist who will bring up this or that argument. So I don't see any arrogance here. What is arrogant when you absolutely misrepresent the other side? That's arrogant, I think. But as I said, I forgive you. I don't take issue with that. And, just to let you know, guys, I actually reached out to Steve, and he even responded to me. I told him, hey, look, let's discuss this, okay, in a live stream. We can do the debate or discussion. And he said, I can't speak for Paul, and these comments come from the other Paul's channel, and he says, I can't speak for Paul, and I would love to have a discussion with you, David. However, just in your post, you made false accusation, like me not using sources, just as you have done with me in the past. No, these are not false accusations, and you can see it right here. For example, Steve Christie says that Jerome's Vulgate included First Esdras in an appendix in the 5th century. I really want to see the source Steve Christie used for this, because actually such appendix in the 5th century by Jerome never existed. Okay, Jerome never translated or included the book of Esdras. It became a part of some Vulgate manuscripts much later, certainly not in the 5th century, and certainly not in an appendix. Okay, so no, I think it's completely justified when I said that he is not using sources. Anyway, he is just, saying because he's not going to debate me, because as he says, before having an interaction with Protestants, maybe you should interact with your fellow Catholics, like Michael Lofton and Trent Horn, etc., etc. And he says that, have you directly approached them already, or at least left comments to them in the comment sections of their videos? Actually, I did. I did respond to Michael Lofton. I did respond to Jimmy Akin. Steve Christie even knows I criticized Michael Lofton, because on Matt Fradd's channel, I actually criticized Michael Lofton, and he knows about this because Steve Christie even responded to this specific comment of mine. So actually I fulfilled his criteria, but he will just make up objections why he doesn't want to approach face me in a discussion or something like that. And if I did somehow, insult Steve Christie, which I am not aware of, but if I did, I honestly apologize. I don't have a problem with that. On the flip side, I expect from Steve Christie, if he thinks he's a Christian, then he should treat me in the same way. He should forgive me if I did somehow ever insult him, which I am not aware of, but as I said, I might be wrong. I apologize. So I expect that Steve, as a Christian, will forgive me and he will forget everything. And yeah, we can have a cordial discussion between him and me, and we can discuss this. I'm open to it. But again, for the accusations that I'm falsely accusing him not using sources, this was, for example, this is a snapshot from Standing for Truth, where he lists the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, and it allegedly did not contain the book of Baruch or the Epistle of Jeremiah. Ladies and gentlemen, the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus is not an Old Testament codex. It's exclusively New Testament with a very few Old Testament books. So if the majority of books are from the New Testament and just a very few from the Old Testament, this doesn't prove anything from how Baruch is not there. So in fact, when you look at his other presentation, this comes, for example, from, I think, Anthony Rogers' channel. He says here that First Esdras is included in Codex Amiatinus. Ladies and gentlemen, Codex Amiatinus is on the website. You can go and directly look up the manuscript, and you will see that Codex Amiatinus doesn't contain First Esdras. So when I say he's not citing his sources, well, he is not, because Codex Amiatinus simply doesn't include First Esdras. That's just a fact. This is not about me attacking, Steve Christie and accusing him. No, this is simply not true. That's all. And it's too bad if he's not acknowledging this, or he's not accepting the criticism, because this is nothing against Steve Christie. This is against his arguments, okay? And on another channel, I told Steve Christie, let's do this discussion or debate or whatever you want to do. I told him, if you are in, we can do it whatever platform or whatever date. All the benefit is yours. I don't need preparation. If need, you can take as many days you want. Just don't make excuses. And then he says here that, and the fact that you state I don't need to do any preparation is an extremely arrogant statement. No matter how well versed you are in a topic, everyone needs preparation before each discussion or debate. No, this is not arrogant, Steve. I'm continuously working on this project. I was doing it in the past, I'm doing it now. I'm working on this all the time. and I got my notes prepared anytime. I'm just continually educated in this. If I would told you that let's do a debate on maxillofacial surgery, where I'm an expert in, we can do it tomorrow. I don't need any preparation in that because I'm continuously educated in it. I see the problem of Esdras, or the so-called issue of Esdras, the very same way. I'm learning it all the time for very few years. I specialized in it. From the whole Deuterocanon canon, I think that's where I know the most. So I don't have a problem. This is not arrogance. I just feel prepared because I got everything prepared. I got my notes prepared. But, as you can see, Steve Christie just uses ad hominems. He likes to do that. Well, ad hominems won't work, Steve Christie. You should focus on the criticisms and the facts, and not, calling me arrogant and condescending. There's nothing condescending in this, So let's continue with the video.
With the later ecumenical church councils of Florence and Trent, Dr. Szaraz conceded in part 2 of his video series on Hippo and Carthage that Augustine of Hippo believed 3rd Esdras is scripture.
Actually, when you look at previous debates from Steve Christie with Trent Horn, for example, with Trent Horn, he specifically claimed that Florence excluded 1st Esdras. Later, he said it may be included, and now he claims Florence included 1st Esdras. So Steve is absolutely inconsistent because a few years back he claimed this, now he claims that. He claimed that he, learned new stuff. There's actually nothing new. He uses the same old sources. He was using the new Catholic Encyclopedia back then. He even cited it with his debate with Trent Horn, and he's citing it now. But he had a different opinion back then and now. So I didn't hear anything new. He didn't show anything new, any new source which would actually support his claim. He just changed his opinion. That's it, But based on what? I have no clue.
Would he consider Greek Esdras canonical? I would argue yes, as a variant of Ezra, sure.
3rd Esdras, historically called 1st Esdras, was a 3rd century BC writing that included 2.5 chapters not found in the later Ecumenical Council of Trent. 1st or 3rd Esdras included the guardsman's story that Augustine believed was scripture, which he quoted in his work City of God, Book 18, Chapter 36, Section 1. Here, Augustine equated 1st or 3rd Esdras as a historical scripture as opposed to a prophetical scripture, just as he did the book of Esther, which Esther was in both his canon as well as the canon lists at Hippo and Carthage, where Augustine was a key member of both councils.
First thing, I don't know what it means, a key member, okay? Maybe Steve is more knowledgeable on conciliar ecclesiology, but there's nothing such as key member. He was a bishop. In a council, a bishop is a bishop, okay? And there are several bishops. All have the same weight. If Steve thinks that Augustine wrote down the list in Carthage or in Hippo, he has to demonstrate that. If he thinks that he had the most influence, he has to demonstrate that. There's nothing like, oh, he was a key member. What does it mean, a key member? How do you want to demonstrate he was something more than the other bishops? He needs to demonstrate that. If he can't, you cannot just assume that, okay? Second thing, what he said, as a variant. He saw that as a variant. That's the very and most important word. Words have meanings, Steve. When I say he saw it as a variant, that's a very important thing. But we'll get back to that later. In the City of God, he compares Esdras to Esther. That is true. And he says that he simply demonstrates that Esdras belongs into the historical book just as Esther. That's all. So it's a historical book, not prophetical. It doesn't belong into the prophets, but into the histories. No, that's not the reason why he brings up Esther. He could have compared it to any other book from the historical books. Why does he compare it to Esther? You know why, Steve? Because Esther does not contain any prophecy, as opposed to other books in the historical books. For example, the book of Samuel contains prophecies, as I demonstrated in my videos. So, no, the point is not to say that Esdras is just as Esther, that both are coming from the group of historical books. That's not the point. You don't have to bring up another book to demonstrate that, because if I say that this comes from the historical books, then it comes from the historical books. I don't have to compare it to anything. The reason why Augustine had to compare it, and specifically to Esther, because Esther, even though some books from the histories contain prophecies like Samuel, Esther does not. So actually Augustine is saying the book of Esdras, just as Esther, does not contain any prophecy, but it's pure history. It's just recorded history. It has zero prophecy in it. That's the point. That is why Michael F. Bird also says that Augustine did not believe that the book of Esdras contains prophecy.
But the part that David didn't really flush out here, that Augustine is getting across here, is that Augustine is saying that this is a historical scripture as opposed to a prophetical scripture. Notice what he says, Esdras also wrote who is historical rather than prophetical, as is also the book of Esther.
Yes, that's the point. That is why he compares it to Esther. Both come from the group of historical books, but what's common in the two books, in Esdras and Esther, is not only that they come from the historical books, but that they don't contain any prophecy, as opposed to other books from the historical books, such as the books of Samuel. You know, this is why Augustine compares Esdras to Esther. So this just demonstrates Augustine didn't believe that it has prophecy, that Esdras contains prophecy.
So he's comparing Esdras to Esther. And Esther is not a book of the prophets. Esther is a book of history. And so that's all he's saying. Augustine is not rejecting the fact that this book is scripture. Because he says, because he goes on to say, which is found to relate for the praise of God, events not far from those times.
When you say Esdras, that is an umbrella term. Esdras was also the canonical Ezra. It was also the Greek Esdras. They didn't make any distinction between the two. Esdras is an umbrella term. And this book, Esdras, had variants. There was the Septuagintal variant, which was the Greek Esdras. There was the Theodotion variant, which was Ezra. And also probably in Symmachus and Aquila. And the church used all of them. In fact, Jerome says that the church uses all of them, all the Greek translations. But only some of the books of Esdras, only one variant, included an extra textual variant, which is in the Greek Esdras. But when Augustine says Esdras, he is not saying, or he's not specifying anything. He just says it's Esdras. That's it. Because in Latin it was called Esdre, okay?
Unless perhaps Esdras is to be understood as prophesying of Christ.
Yes, and this is an ambiguous term. This doesn't prove that Augustine himself believed that this was a prophecy. In fact, he already stated it, that Esdras is the same as Esther. It's pure history. There's no prophecy in it, okay? That is also the statement of Michael F. Bird. So I have scholarly backup as opposed to Steve Christie. The funny thing is, if you look at his previous presentations, for example, with Anthony Rogers or Standing on Truth, he completely excludes this whole passage from the city of God. When you look at his presentation, that in those presentations, the previous ones, he started city of God with Esdras is to be understood as prophesying of Christ, and Christie always said that this is proof that Augustine believed Esdras is prophecy. I mean, that's literally what he said in those previous videos. You can go and check it out. It's on Anthony Rogers' channel. It's on Standing for Truth. Now, because he got a pushback, he includes also these previous passages. Very interesting.
So Augustine is actually saying this is recognized as a historical scripture as opposed to a prophetical scripture, but it could actually be prophesying of Christ. And he gives his argument.
Could or couldn't? I mean, the question is, did Augustine believe that this extra part is a prophecy? It's not it could or couldn't. Did Augustine? Is there enough evidence in the text that will tell you that Augustine himself believed this to be a prophecy? No, there isn't. When I say Esdras is to be understood as prophesying, or unless perhaps it is to be understood, that's not conclusive. Okay, I compare this to when Jerome says, he quotes Judith, and he says, if anyone wishes to accept this book, the same thing he is doing with the shepherd. He rejected actually both books. These ambiguous statements don't prove, unless you have other material from Augustine that will show that, yes, he believed this to be prophecy, then you have a point. What is also very interesting that Augustine, if Augustine himself did believe this is prophecy, why didn't he say so? Why didn't he was much clearer? He could have said, this part here is a prophecy. Just as he did with the book of Baruch, okay? But interestingly, when it comes to Baruch, Steve Christie is going to avoid that statement because and in that case, Augustine somehow is now not a key member in the North African councils, right? Because if Augustine is a key member who explicitly says that Baruch is a prophecy and it's scripture, then why doesn't Steve Christie also acknowledge this? Why is he saying that the North African councils omitted the book of Baruch? You see the double standard here? It's very interesting. All you need to do is look at my presentations, go through it. I know it's long. That is why I said I was studying it since 2009. I'm well prepared when it comes to this issue. And compare it to what Steve is doing. It's just double standards all over the place. That is why I'm not even directly responding to him in those videos, because I think it's really not necessary. When you look at his videos, it's just terrible. That's my honest, and this is not an arrogant or this is not condescending. This is just the fact, okay? Because he does one thing with Esdras, but he's omitting the same thing with Baruch.
Argument based on the book of 3rd Esdras. Notice there's a division between historical books and prophetical books. And the historical books include like 1st and 2nd.
Now, this is another typical thing Steve Christie is doing. Look at here. He brings up the New American Bible to tell you or show what books are in the historical books and what are in the prophetical books, or just to demonstrate how these books can be arranged in different sections. This is completely anachronistic. Why do you use the New American Bible, which came centuries and centuries and centuries after Augustine? Why don't you use Augustine himself? Look at this. I'm going to show you one thing. Actually, I mean, this is just hilarious. Wait a second. So here's my presentation. Look at this. So, just a second. Look at this. Here's the NAB, the New American Bible. And here's what Augustine says. The books now mentioned are history, which contains a connected narrative of the times and follow the order of the events. There are other books which seem to follow no regular order and are connected neither with the order of the preceding books nor with one another, such as Job and Tobias and Esther and Judith, and now he lists the historical books. Now, Augustine includes among the historical books also Job, but when you look at the NAB, the New American Bible, it doesn't contain Job among the historical books. Why are you using a completely different source that has nothing to do with Augustine? These are the things that Steve Christie is doing in his presentations, and this is why I just don't think it's appropriate to even address him in my videos, because this is such a terrible thing to do, being so anachronistic, using completely different sources, you know, and this is what he's doing all over the place. So look, if actually Steve was consistent and did his job, at least on the level of James Swan or James White, I would even mention his name, or I would even address his arguments, but these are just terrible things he's doing, honestly. So, and again, these are just pure facts. You yourself, you can see that the NAB is a different thing than Augustine.
Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the books of Chronicles, and then notice Ezra and Nehemiah. And in the prophetic books, it's got, you know, the books of the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. So what Augustine is saying is that 3rd Esdras is a historical book as opposed to a prophetical book, but he's also arguing that it could be prophesying about Christ as well.
No, he's not arguing that. He says that unless perhaps it is to be understood, that's inconclusive. We know it's in the historical books. We know that. But he just compared it to Esther, which doesn't contain any prophecy, as opposed to other books, such as the books of Samuel.
Plus, he's affirming this is scripture.
No,
and he
not.
believes that this is a book written by 3rd Esdras, or 3rd Esdras is a book written by Ezra himself. But the reason why it's not in the Catholic.
No. Esdras, as I said, is a general term. When I say Esdras, in Augustine's time, I can mean the canonical Ezra, which the Hebrews have, or I can mean the Greek Esdras, okay? The reason why he singled out this extra canonical part is because he knew it's controversial, okay? And that's why I think, if he believed it's a prophecy and it's a genuine and authentic part of Esdras, he could have said that. He could have clearly articulated that that's a prophecy and it belongs to Esdras. But from this statement, all that we know is that it's ambiguous. We don't know what Augustine's opinion is on this part. Even if you say that this comes from the Greek Esdras, that when he says Esdras, he means only the Greek Esdras, that's irrelevant, because the most part of the Greek Esdras is actually canonical. It's just another variant of Ezra. The only part that it has no counterpart in the Hebrew canonical Ezra is these 2 chapters. And when it comes to these 2 chapters, he says, unless perhaps it's a prophecy. That's not conclusive, you know? That doesn't show that he himself regarded this section, this extra canonical part, as scripture. In fact, and as I presented in my video, Augustine believed both the Septuagint and the Masoretic text are inspired. So he believed that Esdras is also the Ezra book of the Jews, and also the Esdras from the Septuagint. Okay, but what I also showed from Gallagher, that Augustine did actually believe that the Septuagint is corrupted, because he knew that some of the texts are not genuine. That's literally in my video. So when you connect the dots, that Augustine didn't believe that the Septuagint was preserved and that it may contain texts that are not genuine. Actually, he himself says that. It's in my video. And he says this is unclear whether this is a prophecy or not, or unless it to be understood, that's an ambiguous term. It doesn't show anything about Augustine's opinion on this part. Okay, that needs to be demonstrated.
Old Testament is because it was not included in the Council of Trent. So, but if this Bible would have been compiled at Hippo and Carthage, there would have been an additional book. It would have been Third Esdras. That would have been in the historical books or possibly in the prophetic books. What Dr. Szaraz doesn't tell you is Augustine wrote City of God about 25 years after Hippo and Carthage convened. Furthermore, in part 2 of
what councils are you referring to, Steve? Hippo is clear, that's 393. Which Carthage? 397 or 419? Because actually I have a slide where I'm addressing specifically when the City of God was written, and there's a huge time range. And actually, it's completely reasonable to say that it was finished even before the last council in 419. So it could have been even completed before 419. Okay, so we have the earliest date for its compilation, and it could have been later, but actually there's no way to tell. So when he says 25 years, well, I want to see the source for that. I mean, scholars are not you cannot estimate the date of City of God with precise here. That's impossible. You can have a slight, you can have slight differences, sometimes even 10 years. So, but as I said, I address this in my video. So again, it's completely possible that City of God was produced before the year 419. As a matter of fact, he could have already written it even earlier. He just published it much later. Okay, it got disseminated much later. So we have actually only older manuscripts. So later manuscripts. So this is, I don't see how this argument stands.
Dr. Szaraz's video series, he concedes Paul Athella, who translated Origen's Hexapla 3 centuries after Hippo and Carthage convened, included First or Third Esdras, sometimes called Greek Esdras, in the 5th column of his 7th century Syro-Hexapla translation. Not only does this mean Origen included First or Third Esdras in his 3rd century Hexapla, this also means centuries after the time of Hippo, Carthage, and Augustine, First or Third Esdras was still recognized as scripture.
The so-called Syro-Hexapla.
No, this doesn't demonstrate that it was viewed as scripture. That's nonsense. Just because someone translates the Septuagint from Origen's Hexapla, that doesn't mean that it was viewed as scripture. In fact, Daniel is viewed as mostly by almost the whole consensus of the church that the true version was Daniel in Theodotion and not in the Septuagint version. So just because Paul of Tella translated the Septuagintal Daniel, that doesn't mean he accepted it as scripture. I mean, this doesn't follow at all. I can translate whatever I want. Doesn't mean that I view it as scripture. That's absolutely nonsense. It's true that the Hexapla contained it because the Septuagintal version of the Hebrew Ezra is the Greek Esdras. And I have no problem saying that. That doesn't prove anything because the church used different versions of different books. He used Theodotion from Daniel. In the older times, Justin Martyr used even the Septuagintal version of Daniel, which later wasn't used that much. The book of Jeremiah was much shorter in the Septuagint than in the Masoretic text, yet both were used. I mean, there was no separate book or separate title for Jeremiah from the Septuagint and Jeremiah from the Masoretic text. When I say Jeremiah, I can mean both. It's not a standalone book. I'm not specifying that I accept the Septuagintal one. Same with Esdras. Esdras, the Greek Esdras, is simply the Septuagintal counterpart of the Masoretic Ezra. So when someone says Esdras, it doesn't tell you which Esdras, it's just Esdras, okay? And that's what I'm saying. I mean, I lay it out this very in great details in my video, but again, Steve tries to prove something from things that simply doesn't follow. Just because Paul of Tella translated the whole Septuagint column, that doesn't prove anything. In fact, he's not even addressing why citations from this Greek Esdras dropped to zero after the North African councils. I never heard one single argument from that. He never explained why the church fathers, when they said that first and second Esdras is one in the Hebrew Masoretic text, how can that be the case if the church fathers didn't view these just simply as variants, and they never thought that Esdras is one specific book? It's just one word, it's just multiple versions of the same book.
Which is a Syriac translation of the fifth column of Origen's hexapla, which was the fifth column was the Septuagint. That was the collection of books which the church fathers knew as the Septuagint. Besides this translation, the person who translated it, called Paul of Tella, he also made some notes on the margin addressing the other translations, also Theodotion, Symmachus, and Aquila. But mainly, basically, his purpose was, in the Syro-Hexapla, to translate the fifth column of Origen's hexapla. And in this Syro-Hexapla, we actually find that first Esdras matches basically the Greek Esdras, but second Esdras in the Septuagint was only Nehemiah, and not the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So
since Augustine...
And this is also important because Steve Christie always says that the Septuagint was, in the Septuagint, first Esdras is the Greek Esdras, and second Esdras is the combined book of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's not true, because Origen's hexapla demonstrates that when we talk about, strictly speaking, about the Septuagint, where even the book of Daniel is in the Septuagint form, as opposed to the large codices as Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, etc., this actually debunks that the codices matches the Septuagint. No, the codices are codices and Septuagint is Septuagint. These are two different things. And this just also demonstrates that really first Esdras in the Septuagint matches the Hebrew Ezra in the Masoretic, and the Nehemiah matches the Nehemiah. So these are just different versions. But the church never officially canonized the Septuagint as the only version to be used. You don't find it anywhere. You don't find it certainly in Augustine. You certainly don't find it in Hippo or Carthage. They just merely list the books. That is why I said Steve has to demonstrate that when they say Esdras, two books of Esdras, they must include the Greek Esdras exclusively as a standalone book. Because if he can't do that, which he can't, then he lost his case. Because I very clearly articulated that when they list the books, they merely list it as umbrella terms. On the Jeremiah, you can have both versions. On the Esdras, you can have both versions, etc., etc. They never specified that we use the Greek Esdras specifically as scripture. That was never the case, and that's why you cannot demonstrate anything.
Was a key member of both councils, which included Ezra 2 books.
Again, he says key member. I don't know what a key member is, Steve. Show me from conciliar ecclesiology or from the history or from anything that Augustine is a key member, and that that the whole council of Carthage and Hippo was a one-man show where everybody blindly followed Augustine. In fact, I demonstrated that when it comes to Hippo in Carthage, they did not follow Augustine, because Hippo and Carthage says that there are 5 Solomonic books, whereas Augustine believed only 3 are Solomonic. So there, you cannot prove the connection between Augustine's opinion and the opinion of Hippo and Carthage. We just have the contrary. We just show, we just can see that no, these councils did not follow Augustine's opinion. So if he thinks that Augustine was blindly followed by everybody and everybody agreed on everything what Augustine said, well, you need to demonstrate that. If you can't, and we have counter evidence, then you have a problem, Steve. Okay, even if I would acknowledge that everything you said about Augustine, which I don't agree at all, then even then you cannot demonstrate that from the primary sources, from Hippo and Carthage, that these specifically follow Augustine's opinion on everything. You can demonstrate that. And as I said, if Steve and I had a debate and the topic was the councils contradicted each other on the book of Esdras, Christie would be taking the affirmative. He has the burden of proof. If when I am accusing someone of something, I need to prove that yes, he is guilty of something. If I can't prove it, then I lost my case. Very easy. So if Steve Christie solely from the acts and the decrees of Hippo and Carthage cannot prove that these councils must have included one of the books of Esdras exclusively as the Greek Esdras, which he can't, then he lost his case. Very easy.
Why would Augustine believe 3rd Esdras is scripture a quarter of a century later, unless it was one of the 2 books included in the church councils of Hippo and Carthage, where Augustine was a key member of and bishop of Hippo? While Dr. Szaraz theorized Augustine simply considered 1st or 3rd Esdras as a variant of the book of Ezra, his theory doesn't work, since the part of 1st or 3rd Esdras, which Augustine believes is scripture, which Dr. Szaraz conceded Augustine believed is scripture, includes the guardsman story, which is not found at the Council of Trent.
I believe that everything what's in the Greek Esdras, Augustine accepted as canonical, as a variant, because he says both the Masoretic and the Septuagint is inspired, but he is hesitant for accepting this extra material. He knows that this is something very weird, because it's not in the inspired Masoretic text, so he knows that this section is actually disputed. So again, I don't have a problem with that Augustine accepted the canonical parts of the Greek Esdras. That's why I said he accepted it as a variant, but he is not affirming this particular section with the guardsman story. He didn't affirm this as scripture, because he says only, well, unless perhaps it is a prophecy. Well, he's not saying it's a prophecy. He just rejected because he compared it with Esther. So, yeah. So, Steve completely misrepresents me.
So to summarize, this means since we have evidence of 1st or 3rd Esdras, also known as Greek Esdras, 1 in Origen's 3rd century Hexapla, 2 Augustine himself embracing it as scripture after Hippo and Carthage.
Origen's Hexapla included also the Hebrew, it also included Aquila, it also included Theodotion, it also included Symmachus. So, what now, Steve? I mean, yeah, Origen's Hexapla was a scholarly work where he just simply wanted to compare the different versions. You see? It doesn't prove anything.
Where he was a key member of both councils.
And no church ever officially recognized the Septuagint as the sole canon. That's a nonsense. You don't find it anywhere. As I lay out in my videos, the different churches use different texts. Some use the Peshitta, some the Old Latin. And actually, when it comes to Hippo and Carthage, they use the Old Latin and not the Greek Septuagint, which is completely ignored by Steve. Now, the problem with the Old Latin is that the Old Latin, we don't have actually a codex of Old Latin. We have fragments or some books interspersed in much later codices within some Vulgate manuscripts, which are from the 8th century, 9th century, very late. None of them are contemporary with the 4th or 5th century councils of Hippo and Carthage. So no, Augustine used the Old Latin, not the Septuagint. So now you have to show me what was in the Old Latin, because Augustine here merely can say that, look, the Greeks do use the Septuagint, but actually we use the Old Latin. That is why I'm not sure whether this part here is actually authentic, you know. So show me an Old Latin manuscript, Steve, contemporary with Hippo and Carthage, that proves your point. You cannot show me anything. Origen's Hexapla was certainly not what was in front of the church fathers in Hippo and Carthage.
And 3, it was translated in the 7th century Syro-Hexapla. This provides...
Yes, it was. So what? Many things were translated. A translation doesn't prove anything. Okay? Just because someone translates something, that doesn't prove anything.
Both pre and post Hippo and Carthage evidence.
In fact, I'm just going to pause it here. So many things were translated. For example, let's see, Enoch was translated into Latin. You don't find actually no one in the Hippo and Carthage in the Latin West accepting Enoch as scripture in the 4th century. So, or you can find other books to be translated into Latin. A translation doesn't mean that just because something is translated, then it means everything is scripture. So this is a fallacy.
That 1st or 3rd Esdras was indeed included as one of the 2 books of Ezra in these late 4th century local church councils, where Augustine was a key member of, which Dr. Szaraz inadvertently supported in his video series. If you want to see more evidence that the canonical lists at the local late 4th century church councils of Rome, Hippo, and Carthage were not identical with the later ecumenical councils of Florence and Trent in the 15th and 16th centuries, click the link on the screen where I made a 3-part video response to Dr. Szaraz from Apocrypha Apocalypse, who indirectly conceded that they weren't identical despite him attempting to argue that they were identical. Also, click the link on the screen where I had a brief discussion on the canon with Austin Suggs from Gospel Simplicity, where I argue for both biblical and historical evidence for the Protestant canon.
Okay, so that's it, guys. So, as I said, the reason why, and this is probably the only video I'm addressing Steve, because, or at least I'm not planning to do any response videos, because the series I made, if I had to respond to every single thing he said in his response to me, it would take not hours but days. I mean, literally, because there are so many errors. The funny thing is, and this, I think this is the thing with which I will conclude. In one of those videos, I demonstrate that Josephus clearly believed that the Greek Esdras was scripture. Yes, you hear me correctly. The reason why is because when he starts in his preface to the books of, in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, he clearly states that Josephus himself is translating the Hebrew scriptures, okay? And he's translating it faithfully without adding anything or omitting anything from it. And then he goes on translating these books, and when it comes to the history that is that lays down the history of Ezra and Nehemiah, he actually used the Greek Esdras, and including the guardsman story. including that part that Steve is not accepting as canonical, but Josephus says, he tells you in his preface that he's going to translate from the Hebrew into Greek, and precisely, without omitting or adding anything. So whatever is in Josephus's Antiquities, that's scripture. That is, because that's what he says. And he says, oh, you know, Josephus could be wrong here because he may have been influenced or may have used the Septuagint. That is rubbish. Josephus never says he's using the Septuagint. He specifically states that he is translating from the Hebrew into Greek. So he's doing a new translation. He's not using a translation, but he's doing a new translation, you know? So no, he's not influenced. And actually, this phrase, without adding or omitting anything, that's the very same statement you find in his passage in Against Apian, when he talks about the 22 books. So that, which is actually a defense of the Antiquities of the Jews. So if Esdras is actually used as scripture to lay down the history of Ezra, then actually that's among the 22 books. Very simple as that. Now, Steve goes on speculate everything. Oh, he might have been wrong on this, and you know, he was a scholar, he was not perfect, he might have used the Septuagint. These are all speculations. Steve is simply not faithful to what Josephus says. Then he goes on saying, oh yes, but as I conceded that he is hyperbolic sometimes. Yes, he's hyperbolic sometimes. He's hyperbolic in Against Apian, because Against Apian is an apologetical work. He's in an apologetical mood, you know? So he's going to say that all the Jews from the beginning, from the very birth, know what the scriptures are. Yes, he says this in an apologetical work, but the Antiquities, that's not an apologetical work. That's a historical work. Josephus is faithfully translating the Hebrew scriptures. Now, Steve goes on saying that, well, if he included if the Jews included the Greek Esdras, then that's a problem for everybody. No, it's not. It's not a problem for Catholics. We don't follow Josephus. Sorry. Josephus is no authority for us. It's a problem for you because you use him as an argument for your canon, where actually Josephus himself doesn't agree with Steve Christie on the books of Esdras. So this is a much bigger problem for Steve than for me, but he is just dismissing with his own opinions without being faithful to Josephus himself. He also says, well, the Greek Esdras, that's a 3rd century translation, and therefore it cannot be among the 22 books, because if it's 3rd century, then and the 22 books were written until Artaxerxes, which would be sometime in the 4th century, then the Greek Esdras was just written too late. The problem that Steve is doing here, that he's referring to the Greek translation of the Greek Esdras. But actually, this Greek translation comes from a Semitic origin, which is much older than we have in the Greek. So, and Josephus tells you he is translating the Hebrew. He's not using the Greek. So when Steve says, "Oh, it comes from the 3rd century," that's not the Hebrew version that is coming from the 3rd century. That's the Greek translation. But Josephus tells you, I have in front of me the Hebrew original scriptures, and I'm going to translate it without adding anything or omitting anything. That means he treats them as scripture because he values them so much, he cannot alter them at all, you know? So yes, Steve is inconsistent, he cannot tackle with this. He just merely presents his opinion, but he cannot simply be faithful to Josephus. And yeah. So God bless everybody, take care.